Let's open to Isaiah 41 this evening. As you're opening to Isaiah 41, Isaiah, one of the unique books in the Bible, 66 chapters. It exactly parallels the structure of the Bible. 39 chapters are very, very reflective of the Old Testament, and the 40th chapter has John the Baptist, voice crying in the wilderness prophecy, and it's very parallel to the New Testament. But those 66 books are a wonderful treasury of God's promises to Israel. In the 41st chapter, God explains those promises, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But God has made hundreds, literally thousands, of promises to the nation Israel. Specifically, He made those promises to the direct descendants, He says, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In fact, Jesus alludes to this in the New Testament when He's promising heaven. He said, "Many of you that hear me preaching, when you respond in faith, will someday get to sit down in heaven at the banquet with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So Jesus describes heaven as a banquet that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are already there. I mean, it's a fascinating thought how this heaven we're going to reflects the old and the new, and especially the 12 tribes being the wonderful gates into the city and the 12 foundation stones, the apostles. But the Jewish people, in fact, have more verses and chapters of the Bible devoted to them, to the nation of Israel, and their future on earth before the end of the world than any other subject. There's no other subject. Prayer, glory of God, ark, tabernacle. I mean, you pick any subject. The New Testament, period. There's only 250 chapters in the whole New Testament. And there are many times more than that chapters about what God is going to do with Israel. It's the single largest subject covered in the Bible. All of the promises and predictions that God made, all these hundreds and even thousands, are part of His offer to us so that we, for the 3,000 years since He made those promises, so that we could be sure we knew that He was God. That's what Isaiah says. God says, I'm making all these promises about Israel so that in the future, when you see me do these things, you'll know who I am, that I am God. Now, if we took all those promises that He made to Israel, there are 12 clear kind of sets or groupings. You know how you sort, especially at our house, we sort the clothes and the socks. There just seems to be bazillions of them, and always 2 or 3 that are mixed up, and so then you have to sort them out. Well, if you took all the verses and sorted them out and dealt them into piles about Israel, you'd find that there are 12 kind of overarching promises that God made. And we're actually tonight looking at the 6th one, and we've been kind of looking at these in between all the different things we've been doing on Sunday nights, between baptisms and communions and send-offs and missionary commissionings and everything else. So I'll refresh you of them tonight. But 12 clear groups. But we could even more narrow the field of the hundreds of prophecies, and the 12 that I mentioned, you could narrow them all down to 3 really significant promises God made. I call those the big 3 promises that God made to Israel. And these 3 are the focus of much of the world's news-keeping media of our world tonight. The 3 big promises God made. And these 3 promises are red alerts for any student of Bible prophecy. God says in Isaiah 41, and we'll start in verse 21 in a moment, God says, I'm going to stake my reputation, I'm going to stake my reliability on prophecy. God says, no other religion in the world, none, have prophecy. Now they have smatterings here and there, but none of the world religions have prophetic literature that specifically describes future events that could be disproven if they don't happen. Now they have vague things, the world will end. That is, that's a good one. I mean, anybody can predict that. But to say that it will end when the entire armed forces of the whole world focus their attention on one little postage stamp sized property and move in trying to conquer one city And it's not Rome, and it's not Athens, and it's not London, and it's not Moscow, it's not New York City, it's not Washington, D.C., and it's not Beijing or Shanghai or Delhi or Mumbai or whatever. It's Jerusalem. Now that's easy to disprove, right? Because if they'd have just said some city, but it's specified what city. And it says all the nations. So God says, I'm going to stake my entire reputation on the prediction. Here's the big three. Number one, that the Jewish people will be acting as a sovereign nation at the end of the world. Now that was a big prediction because when Isaiah finished this book, Israel was no longer a sovereign nation. You understand that? They were being occupied by Babylon and slowly being deported until they were finally destroyed and dispersed across the world. So they were not a sovereign nation from 2,600 years ago when Isaiah wrote this on. So God says, when you see Israel come back to having one who reigns over them, not a group of people that wander around, the wandering Jews, but when they coalesce into a nation, he says that should cause red alerts to go place. So number one, the first of the big three, that Israel would return after their destruction 600 years before Christ. Israel would return as a nation. So that's the first one. That's very verifiable. There's hundreds of descriptions of that. Number two, that they would not only be a sovereign nation, but they would be in possession of Jerusalem at the end. Now we're getting, you talk about making it hard to, it's kind of like the mega whatever lottery, so many people bought tickets, that everyone you buy has a less and less chance, and might as well just burn a $5 bill. If you have the temptation to get the lottery, get a 5 and burn it and throw it on the ground. You're just as close and are as wise with your money. But you know what I mean? There are decreasing chances. The more details are there and the more entrants in the lottery, well, the more details that God gives, the decreasing ability he has to have any wiggle room. And he says, Israel will be a nation. They weren't when he said it. Israel will control Jerusalem. They had lost control of Jerusalem when he said that. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to say, and they will be seeking to build a temple that will cause such a stir that all the world's nations will rise against them. Now that was ludicrous for 1,200 years. But then, in about 700 AD, Islam swept northern Africa, southern Europe, and the Middle East. And Islam built their third holiest site over Judaism, over the temple that Herod and Solomon had built, and Zerubbabel had rebuilt, and that had been constructed on Mount Moriah, where Abraham had offered Isaac, and on the same ridge of mountain where David had stopped the death angel with the sacrifice of obedience, and where Jesus had been crucified. So the most sacred spot to God, where Isaac prefigured Christ, where the temple sacrifices were offered, where David offered a sacrifice that stopped the death angel, where Jesus was crucified on the north end of that same ridge, that most sacred spot to God on earth, Islam took over. And now it's become the tinderbox. It's like a detonator in plastic explosives. It's ready to blow up at any moment. And so the big three are, Israel would be a sovereign nation, Jerusalem would be in their hands, and they would be trying to build a temple. Now, it used to be only Hal Lindsey talked about the temple building. Did you know now that the Associated Press talks about that CNN talks about that they say they're actually crazy people and they're trying to do this, and we know it's ridiculous. Who would ever want to kill animals and spill blood around? Even though a lot of religions in the world do that. But they just, whenever they refer to God's people, the Jews, there's a derision. And that's the sixth element, the sixth promise. God says you're going to be hated by the world, by all nations. And we'll see that